Okay, time for a change of pace, and let's talk about a topic of conversation that's increasingly being debated at the dinner table here in France, and this is Christmas is around the corner. What is the greenest option between an artificial tree or a natural fir tree? And to take us through this is our science editor, Julia Seeger. Julia, before we dig into which one we should choose to minimise our carbon footprint, tell us a little bit more about the tradition of the Christmas tree. Where did it come from?
It's actually a very exciting story. It's an age-old tradition dating back to the antiquity. It represents the conifer at the time represented the victory of light and life over death and darkness. Our ancestors used the conifer to celebrate the winter solstice, which actually corresponds to that day in the year, the 21st of December, where you have the shortest day length. And then of course, it reverses. Starting on the 22nd, the days start being longer, and hence there's more light. That's why we talk about the victory of light over darkness. And at the time, the trees were decorated with wheat, fruit, and flowers. Now, in 354, the church, who was celebrating the Nativity of Christ just a few days later on the 25th, they decided to take over this pagan ritual. And that's why, starting in the 11th century, we started seeing trees with, garnished with these red apples. And that, of course, is a representation of the tree in the Garden of Eden, and the garlands represent the serpent and temptation. Now, this fir tree tradition actually started in France in the 12th century in the region of Alsace, which today, as you know, is a French region, but back in the day it was part of the German Empire. And the reason why it started there is because the Protestants were the first ones to take this tradition because they wanted to stand out compared to the Catholics. And the tradition really took on, became popular when the wife of Louis XV, who was king at the time, decided to post a huge Christmas tree inside the Versailles Palace. So here's a representation of it. And a century later, the Duchess of Orléans also did so in the Jardin des Tuileries. So you may hear or read on the internet that Latvia or Estonia are the birthplaces of the Christmas tree, but in reality, historians believe that everything started in the region of Alsace.
Which is really interesting because I think many people would have no idea about that. So the big question is, are French people still buying Christmas trees?
Well, we still have 1 out of 4 households who are going to buy a Christmas tree, and 84% of them are going to favor a natural tree compared to an artificial one. And so, of course, as you said, one of the huge debates that happens every year around Christmas is what's the best choice? At least what's the greenest choice? And there's one study that was made in Quebec in 2009 that tried to answer that question, to try to quantify the life cycle of a natural fir tree. So obviously it depends on its origin, on how much it's traveled, but for the sake of the study, they decided to compare a natural fir tree, which would have traveled about 150 kilometers, compared to an artificial tree coming from China that you would keep for about 6 years. And of course, when you look at those conditions, the results are largely favorable to the natural fir tree, with 3 kilograms of CO2 per year compared to about 8 per year for the artificial tree. Now, of course, the study is a little bit biased because, first of all, it was conducted back in 2009 and things have changed quite a bit, but also because it assumes that the tree is actually local. It's only traveled 150 kilometers. So in this situation, it would mean that the tree is grown in France. But we know that about 20 to 30% of trees that are bought in France are actually imported from Finland and also Denmark. And also what's changed since 2009 is now you have European companies making artificial trees and who have considerably lowered the carbon footprint of transportation. Now, of course, it's not easy to make these calculations of carbon footprints because there are so many different elements to take into consideration. On one hand, you have the artificial tree that you can reuse every year, and those companies in Europe making them. And on the other, you have the natural fir tree that you can recycle, that you can mulch, that you can use and feed compost. And it also stores CO2, but it only does so for a limited amount of time when it's still in the ground. Once you've cut it, the tree, of course, releases all of the CO2 that it's captured. So it's only temporary, and that's actually what we call the last breath of the tree. Now, if you've actually bought an artificial tree, you can reverse the carbon footprint if you keep it for at least 7 years if it comes from Europe, or if you've kept it for at least 20 years if it comes from China. So what's ideal here, what we can take out of this study is the ideal is to take a natural tree that locally grown, of course, and it's also important because it can help in a big way farmers who are, French farmers, for instance. Now, there's also the problem of the fact that some of these forests, these conifer forests, they can acidify the soil because, there's all these different branches and there's humidity. And what associations are saying here is that these plantations don't stay for longer than 10 years, so you don't have time to have that sort of rug of these
The needles.
the needles and the branches. So that's one of the good parts also of having these plantations in France, and most of them are actually in Morvan and in Bourgogne.
Thank you very much, and it certainly means that I will look at the Christmas tree tonight when I get home with a great deal of knowledge. Thank you for that.